Hey, listener, ever wonder, how we even decide which laws are fair? I mean, we live in a place where everybody's got different opinions, so how do we make sure the rules we've got to live by actually work for everyone?
Right.
Well, that's what we're going to be diving into today.
Yeah.
The fascinating world of public justification.
Mm.
We're unpacking some excerpts here from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And don't worry, I promise to make it way less intimidating than it sounds.
It sounds very intimidating.
Right.
Yeah.
All those big words.
Big
But it's
words.
a really cool idea.
Yeah, it really boils down to this. How can we justify, the use of power?
Ooh.
Especially when it comes to things like laws that everyone has to follow,
Right.
even if they don't agree.
Yeah, because we can't just force people to do things just because we think it's right.
Right.
There needs to be a better reason.
Exactly. Public justification is all about finding reasons that everyone, even with different viewpoints,
Yeah.
could accept as valid for why a certain law or policy exists.
Okay, so this isn't just some dusty philosophical idea. This is about the very foundation of how we function as a society.
Yeah.
Let's dig into those excerpts and see how this public justification thing actually works.
All right. Well, to understand where public justification comes from, we kind of have to go back to the roots of social contract theory.
Okay.
Thinkers like Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and even Kant were grappling with this idea of consent
Right.
and how it relates to political power.
Oh, yeah, the social contract. That we all agreed to follow the rules, even though, let's be honest, nobody actually signed anything.
Right. So the early thinkers started with this idea of empirical consent,
Okay.
what people actually agree to. But
Yeah.
as you said, that's not always realistic.
Yeah.
So then they shifted towards this idea as normative consent, what people should agree to if they were being perfectly rational.
So less about what we actually agree on right now, and more about what we would agree on if we were all, thinking clearly and had all the facts.
Precisely. Then Kant came along and he first introduced this idea of public justification.
Okay.
It didn't really gain traction until much later in the 1990s, thanks to John Rawls.
Oh, Rawls. Okay, so what was Rawls' take on it?
Well, Rawls was dealing with what he called reasonable pluralism, the very real fact that in a free society, people are going to have different yet completely reasonable views on core values.
Which makes total sense, but then how on earth do we find justifications for laws in a world where people disagree fundamentally on so much?
Well, Rawls offered a crucial principle to guide us, the public justification principle, or PJP.
PJP?
It states that a law is only truly justified if every single person can find a good enough reason to endorse it, even if their reasons are totally different.
Every single person. Wait, hold on. So let's say I think a law is good for one reason, and you think it's good for a totally different reason. That still counts.
That's the beauty of it. The PJP recognizes that different people might support the same law for completely different reasons.
Okay.
It's not about everyone thinking alike. It's about different reasons all converging on a common outcome.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this works. It's like a puzzle where all the pieces fit together,
Right.
even if they're different shapes and colors.
Yeah.
But before we get too far, I have to ask, what makes a reason good enough in the first place?
That's where things get interesting.
Okay.
We have to ask, does a good reason need to be something someone actively believes right now? Or could it be something they would agree with
Okay.
if they had all the information and were thinking perfectly rationally?
So are we talking about real-world people or some kind of idealized,
Right.
perfectly rational version of people?
That's a huge question in the whole public justification debate. Just how much do we idealize citizens when we think about their reasons? Do we imagine them as perfectly informed, unbiased robots?
Right.
Or do we account for their human flaws and limitations? And how does that impact what we consider a justified law?
So it's like we're trying to figure out how much fantasy football we're allowed to play when it comes to people's reasoning.
Yeah.
But wouldn't assuming everyone is perfectly rational and be a bit, unrealistic?
You've hit on a major point of contention. And believe me, that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to unpacking the PJP.
Oh, boy.
Oh.
I can only imagine. So besides this whole, idealization dilemma,
Right.
what else do we need to think about when we're trying to figure out this public justification thing?
Well, we have to consider what exactly we're trying to justify. Are we talking about specific laws?
Right.
Or broader principles like those found in a constitution?
Okay, and what about who we're considering the public?
Yeah.
Is it only citizens of a country?
Yeah.
Do future generations count?
These are all great points.
Okay.
We also have to grapple with how this justification actually happens.
Okay.
Is it through big public debates and discussions, or is it something that evolves more organically over time?
Yeah.
So,
Okay, I'm already feeling like my brain is doing gymnastics.
lots to consider.
But before we get too overwhelmed,
Right.
I think we should take a closer look at some of the key elements of this public justification principle.
Okay.
What do you say we start with sufficient reasons and unpack what exactly makes a reason strong enough to actually justify something?
Let's dive into that. The strength of a reason, its sufficiency,
Okay.
isn't just about how many people agree with it.
Okay.
It's more about whether the reason can stand up to scrutiny.
Okay.
Imagine you're building a house.
Okay.
A flimsy shack might work for a little while,
Yeah.
but it's not going to last.
Right.
A well-built house needs a strong foundation to survive storms and the test of time.
So it's not enough for a reason to just feel right to people.
Yeah.
It needs to have some real substance behind it.
Exactly. And just like different houses have different purposes, like a family home versus a skyscraper.
Right.
The strength of a reason needs to match what it's justifying. We probably don't need a super complex philosophical justification for a parking ticket.
Yeah.
But when it comes to something like freedom of speech,
Right.
the reasons better be rock solid.
That makes sense. But how do we decide, like, what level of justification is needed for different situations?
Well, it all comes down to reasonableness.
Okay.
We have to be able to step back from our own personal opinions and look at things from a neutral, objective standpoint.
Right.
Think of it like being a judge in a courtroom.
Okay.
You can't just rule in favor of the side you like better.
Right.
You have to weigh the evidence fairly
Okay.
and apply the law consistently.
So it's like putting on our reasonableness hats
Yeah.
and being impartial referees in the game of public policy.
Exactly. And this idea of reasonableness also plays a big role in another aspect of public justification.
Okay.
What types of reasons we consider acceptable?
You mean, like, do those reasons need to be the same for everyone?
Yeah.
Or can people have different reasons for supporting the same law?
That's a key debate in public justification, often framed as consensuses versus convergence.
Okay, let's break those down.
Okay.
What's consensus all about?
Think of consensus theorists as architects who love a universal blueprint.
Okay.
They believe that for a law to be truly justified, everyone needs to agree on the same basic reasons for supporting it.
Okay.
It's like everyone agreeing on the exact same design for a house, the layout, the materials, everything.
So everyone's singing from the same reasonableness as hymn sheet.
Exactly. But as you can imagine, getting everyone to agree on every single reason can be pretty tough.
Yeah.
Especially in a diverse society where people have such a wide range of values, that's where convergence theory comes in.
Convergence sounds a bit more flexible.
It is. Convergence theorists are like architects who embrace a more eclectic style.
Okay.
They say it's okay for people to have different reasons for supporting the same law,
Okay.
as long as those reasons are all valid and can coexist.
Right.
Imagine a house where each room has a totally different style. Maybe one is modern, one is Victorian, and one is rustic.
I like that analogy. So it's less about everyone agreeing on every detail and more about, like, different paths leading to the same destination.
Precisely. It's about making sure that everyone has solid reasons for their support,
Yeah.
even if those reasons are built on different foundations.
Okay. I think I'm getting that, but I'm still kind of hung up on this whole idealization thing. How do we decide how much we need to, like, upgrade people's reasoning when we're thinking about public justification? Are we pretending everyone has a PhD in philosophy?
That's a question that philosophers argue about all the time.
Yeah.
There's a whole spectrum when it comes to idealization.
Okay.
On one end, you have people's actual real-world reasoning with all its flaws and biases. On the other end, you have perfectly rational beings who know all the facts and make decisions based on pure logic.
So on one hand, we have, like, realistic reasoning, and on the other, we have reasoning on steroids.
Huh. That's a great way to put it. Of course, most theorists land somewhere in between those extremes.
Right.
We need to assume people are capable of being reasonable.
Yeah.
But we also can't pretend they're flawless robots.
Right. It's like we're trying to find that sweet spot between respecting people's autonomy and acknowledging that we all make mistakes sometimes.
Absolutely. And this idea of idealization becomes even more important when we consider what exactly we're trying to justify. Remember, we talked about granularity.
Right. Whether we're justifying a specific law or a broader principle.
Yes.
Like something in a constitution. So how does idealization play into that?
Think about it this way. If we're trying to justify a parking ticket, we probably don't need to assume people are perfectly rational geniuses.
Right.
Parking rules are usually pretty straightforward.
Yeah, it's not exactly a philosophical dilemma.
But when we're dealing with something like, say, freedom of speech, that's when idealization becomes more crucial.
Okay.
The reasons supporting that kind of fundamental right need to be strong enough to withstand any challenge.
Because the stakes are much higher when we're talking about the core principles of a just society.
Exactly. It's like the difference between building a garden shed and building a skyscraper.
Right.
You don't cut corners on the foundation of a skyscraper, and you shouldn't skimp on the reasoning behind fundamental rights.
Makes sense. So we've covered sufficient reasons, reasonableness, consensus versus convergence and idealization.
Okay.
What else is there to consider when it comes to this whole public justification puzzle?
Well, we also need to think about how public justification actually happens in the real world.
Yeah.
Is it a formal process, like a courtroom trial? or something more informal and organic?
Right, because so far we've been talking about these ideas in a very theoretical way.
Yeah.
How does it all play out in practice?
Well, there are a few different schools of thought on that. Some theorists believe that public justification requires actual dialogue and debate, where people openly share their ideas and try to persuade each other.
So like a giant town hall meeting where everyone gets to voice their opinions.
Exactly. Others focus more on finding principles that are inherently fair and reciprocal, even if people don't actually sit down and debate them.
So it's less about the process of arguing and more about the outcome being just.
Right. Then you have theorists who see it as a kind of bargaining process where people negotiate and try to reach agreements that benefit everyone involved.
Like a giant game of let's make a deal where everyone tries to get the best possible outcome.
You could say that. And finally, you have evolutionary theorists who believe that public justification doesn't necessarily require any conscious deliberation or agreement at all.
Interesting.
They think that justified norms just naturally emerge over time through a process of social evolution.
So it's like survival of the fittest for ideas. The most reasonable and justifiable ones eventually win out.
Exactly. It's like how languages evolve. Nobody planned it, but certain words and phrases become more common because they're more effective.
Wow, so many different ways this whole public justification thing can supposedly work. But I have to ask, is there any guarantee that it actually will work?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right.
And honestly, there's no easy answer.
Okay.
Public justification is an ongoing process, and there's always a chance it could fail.
Yeah.
Maybe people are unwilling to engage in reasoned debate, or maybe they just can't agree on what a good enough reason is.
Right. So even with all this philosophy, there's no magic formula to ensure we have a perfectly just society.
Unfortunately not. But that doesn't mean we should give up on the whole idea of public justification. In fact, I think understanding these concepts is more important now than ever, especially in a world where people seem to be more divided than ever.
It's like we need a reasonableness software upgrade to deal with all the complexities of the 21st century.
I like that. But before we get too carried away with the idealism, we should probably talk about some of the challenges and criticisms of public justification.
Yeah.
Sure, not everyone buys into this whole thing.
I was just thinking that. What are some of the objections people have raised?
Well, one common criticism is that it's just too idealistic. Public justification assumes people are going to be rational and engage in good faith debate.
Yeah.
But the reality of politics is often much messier than that.
Because in the real world, decisions aren't always based on logic and reason.
Right.
Right? Sometimes it's more about who has the most power or who can shout the loudest.
You got it. Another criticism is that public justification can't address every important issue. Some things like deeply personal moral beliefs are just too subjective to be resolved through public reason.
So are you saying there are some things that are off limits when it comes to public justification?
That's a tough question, and there's no easy answer.
Okay.
But even if we acknowledge its limitations, public justification is still a valuable framework for thinking about how we make decisions as a society. It encourages us to see common ground, respect different perspectives, and ensure that the use of power is legitimate.
It's like we're trying to build a bridge between individual freedom and collective responsibility.
Yeah.
And public justification is one of the tools in our toolbox.
I like that analogy. And like any tool, it's important to understand both its strengths and weaknesses.
Okay, so we've explored the history of public justification, dug into the public justification principle, and even talked about some of the challenges.
Right.
But I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, the liberty principle. How does that fit into the bigger picture?
The liberty principle is like a safety net that protects individual freedoms from being trampled in the name of public justification.
Okay.
It basically says that we should start with the assumption that people should be free and that any restriction on that freedom needs extra justification to be legitimate.
So it's like a reminder that public justification isn't a free pass for the government to do whatever it wants.
Exactly.
Individual rights still matter.
And it's not just about protecting people from the government. It's also about fostering a culture that values individual autonomy and diversity of thought. The liberty principle reminds us that a truly just society allows people to pursue their own goals and values, as long as they don't infringe on the rights of others.
So we have public justification ensuring laws are based on solid reasons everyone can get behind.
Right.
And we have the liberty principle acting as a safeguard against any potential tyranny of the majority.
Right.
They work together to create a balance.
Precisely.
All right, my brain is officially full.
Lots to think about.
But before we overload our listener circuits, Let's talk about why any of this actually matters. Because I'm sure some people are thinking, okay, this is all very interesting, but how does it affect my life?
That's the question we'll explore in our next segment.
Okay.
Because while this might seem like a lofty philosophical concept, public justification actually has real-world implications for how our society works, how laws are made, and even how we interact with each other. So listeners, stick with us. So we were talking about how this public justification thing can impact us in real life.
Right, like how does it actually show up in our day-to-day lives? It feels kind of big and abstract.
Well, it's all about the rules and laws that we live by, like traffic laws or regulations about the environment or laws about things like healthcare and education.
Oh, so it's not just about those super controversial issues you always hear about on the news?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Every single law, even the little ones, need to be justified to the people.
Because if folks don't get why a law exists, they're not going to follow it right.
Exactly. And that's where things start to fall apart. It's like trying to play a game without knowing the rules.
Yeah, total chaos.
Exactly. And even worse, if people feel like laws are just being forced on them with no good reason, it creates this resentment and distrust towards the government.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Which can lead to instability and even violence.
Okay, so it's like this public justification idea is the glue that holds society together.
Yeah, you could say that. Without it, things start to break down.
So it's not just about preventing things from falling apart. It's also about making things better, right?
Right? When people feel like they have a say in the rules, they're more likely to accept them. And when laws are based on solid reasons that everyone gets, it makes it easier to figure out how to improve them or change them as our values evolve.
That's a really cool way to think about it. So it's like a feedback loop that helps us keep refining and improving our laws over time.
Exactly.
I'm starting to see how powerful this concept can be. Do you have any examples of how public justification has actually led to positive change?
Oh, definitely. The civil rights movement is a perfect example. Think about how activists were able to so clearly explain why things like segregation and discrimination were wrong. They appealed to our shared values of equality and fairness, and they presented strong evidence that those very values were being violated.
Wow, so they basically won the public justification argument, and that opened the door for actual changes in the law.
Precisely. And we see the same thing happening all the time with other movements like environmentalism and LGBTQ rights. Public justification is about making things fairer for everyone.
This is making me feel hopeful, but let's be real here. This whole public justification thing sounds like a ton of work. It requires a lot of open communication and critical thinking from everyone, right?
It definitely does. And it's not a one-time thing. It's a process that we always need to be working on. But understanding these ideas can actually help us become better citizens.
It's like if we know the rules of the game, we can be more effective players.
I like that analogy. So next time you come across a law or a policy that you don't understand or agree with, don't just get upset about it. Ask yourself, what are the justifications for this? And do those justifications actually hold up?
It's like putting on our public justification glasses and really examining the world around us.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to have respectful conversations with people who might see things differently. Public justification is about finding common ground through dialogue, not shutting down dissenting voices.
You know, it's really interesting how this concept can be used in all sorts of different parts of life, not just in politics or lawmaking.
Totally. It applies to our personal relationships, our jobs, even how we behave online.
It's about treating each other with respect
Right.
and understanding that we all have different perspectives
Yeah.
and trying to find ways to make decisions together that feel fair to everyone.
Absolutely. Public justification is a way of being in the world. It's about creating a more just and equitable society for everyone.
That's a beautiful thought and a great place to wrap up this part of our deep dive. Listener, we'll be right back after a short break to continue exploring the fascinating world of public justification. Welcome back, listener. We've been unpacking this whole idea of public justification, but now let's talk about how it actually affects us in real life.
Yeah, public justification, it's kind of like the foundation of a healthy democracy. It helps to hold a diverse society together, ensures the rules we live by are fair and legit, even if we don't personally agree with every single one.
Okay, so paint me a picture here. How does this show up in our daily lives? Give me some examples.
Well, think about like all those laws we bump into every day, traffic laws, environmental regulations, laws about healthcare and education, all that stuff.
So it's not just about those big controversial issues that are always in the headlines?
Right. It's not just about the hot button stuff like abortion or gun control. Every single law, even the little ones, needs to have public justification.
Because even a tiny little law can affect people's lives in a big way.
Exactly. And if folks don't understand or accept the reasons behind a law, they're less likely to follow it, and that's when things start to break down.
Right, it's like trying to play a game where nobody knows the rules.
Exactly. Total chaos. And on a bigger scale, if people feel like laws are being shoved down their throats without any good reason, it just breeds resentment and distrust towards the government.
Oh yeah, that makes sense.
And that can lead to instability and sometimes even violence.
Okay, so public justification is like the oil that keeps the gears of society turning smoothly.
Yeah, I like that analogy. Without it, things get rusty and eventually grind to a halt.
And it's not just about keeping things running smoothly, right? It's also about making things better.
Absolutely. When people feel like they have a voice in shaping the rules, they're more likely to buy into the outcome. And when laws are rooted in solid justifications that everyone can understand, it becomes much easier to see where things might be falling short
Okay?
or where we need to update things to reflect our values.
So it's like this feedback loop that's always helping us to refine and improve things over time.
Precisely. A great example of this is the civil rights movement.
Okay?
One of the key reasons it was so successful was because activists were able to articulate really clearly why segregation and discrimination were wrong. They appealed to those shared values of equality and fairness, and they had the evidence to show that those values were being violated.
So they basically won that public justification argument. And that paved the way for legal and social change.
Exactly. And we see this same dynamic at play in a lot of other social movements too, like environmentalism and LGBTQ plus rights. Public justification isn't just about preserving the status quo, it's about creating a more just world for everyone.
This is honestly making me feel inspired. But being realistic for a second, achieving public justification, that's got to be a lot of work, right? It takes open dialogue, critical thinking, a willingness to compromise.
Oh, for sure. It's not easy and it's a never-ending process. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't strive for it. In fact, I think that really understanding the ideas behind public justification can help us become better, more engaged citizens.
Like if we know how the game works, we can be more effective players.
Right. So the next time you encounter a law or a policy that you don't get or you disagree with, don't just get frustrated. Take a step back and ask yourself, what are the reasons for this? And do those reasons make sense?
Put on those public justification glasses and really examine the situation.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to have respectful conversations with people who have different viewpoints. Remember, public justification, it's all about finding common ground through dialogue, not shutting down dissenting voices.
That's such an important point. You know, this whole idea of public justification, it's not just limited to politics and lawmaking. It applies to so many areas of life.
I agree. It's relevant to our relationships, how we function in our workplaces, how we interact online. It's really about how we treat each other and how we make decisions together.
It's about recognizing that we all come from different places and finding ways to make things work for everyone.
Yeah. Public justification at its core, it's about respect, finding common ground, making sure that decisions feel fair and legitimate to everyone involved.
Wow, this has been such an eye-opening deep dive. Public justification, it's not just some dusty old philosophical idea. It's a vital part of a healthy society, and it's something we can all practice in our daily lives.
I'm glad to feel that way. And remember, this is just the beginning of your exploration. There's a whole world of thought out there about public justification. So keep learning, keep thinking critically about these ideas.
So listener, take what you've learned today and apply it to your own life. Question those justifications you encounter, engage in thoughtful debate, and strive to be an active, informed citizen. Because public justification is something we can all participate in to create a more just and equitable world.
Absolutely. By engaging with these ideas, we can build a society where power is used fairly and where everyone feels heard and respected.
That's a future worth striving for. Thanks for joining us on another deep dive.